Jeremy Narby, anthropologist, author, activist, explorer. You are a truly multidimensional being. You have been a quiet but highly effective activist to defend the indigenous rights of Amazonian peoples and to help these nations to develop their own political, economic, and cultural institutions and projects. Jeremy, you spent several years with the Ashanincha people in the Peruvian Amazon, and since 1989, you've worked for a Swiss nonprofit called Nouvelle Planète, helping indigenous peoples of the Amazon in land titling, bilingual education, and sustainable resource use, the preservation of plant knowledge, and the environmental monitoring of petrochemical companies in their resistance to their abuses. In 33 years of activist fundraising, you've been able to help Amazonian people to protect 12 million acres of land through land titling. That's 1% of the total landmass of the Amazonian basin. You've taken on the challenge of reconciling traditional indigenous ecological, psychospiritual, scientific, and cosmological worldviews. You've written Cosmic Serpent, Intelligence in Nature, Plant Teachers. You're part of a quest to form a new worldview or narrative which integrates the indigenous understanding that humans are not above and beyond nature, but totally embedded in the web of life with the best aspects of modern scientific thought. Jeremy, in your latest book, co-written with Amazonian shaman Rafael Chanchuri Pizuri, you discuss plants such as ayahuasca as teachers. What do Amazonian people mean when they talk about plant teachers?
Well, thank you for your kind words. And to answer your question, it is actually a somewhat complicated question because it implies going between two ways of understanding the world. By asking the question, let's say in English, where in, oh, hold on just a second, in English, where in the cultures of people who usually speak English in England, in North America, they don't, people do not usually think that plants teach or communicate to humans. And so just the very idea that a plant could be a teacher is somewhat dissonant. But in the Amazonian view, so you have a lot of different, 400 different cultures in the Amazon, but among a great number of them, they view plants and animals as beings like us. And they think that certain species of plants are full of information, that when you ingest them, so what is a plant teacher? It is a plant that once you ingest it, you pay attention to its effects on your body and on your mind. And in doing so, you learn things, you get new ideas. A Western scientific way of calling these plants might be that they are psychoactive. So they activate our brains, and then we see images and get ideas. Actually, these plants have been somewhat controversial in Western cultures, hallucinogenic. They've been illegal in many cases. And so the word hallucination is a problematic word, but let's not go there. In indigenous Amazonian cultures, they don't have the word hallucination. They say these plants, they allow you to see. To see what? To see what you need to know. When I was a young anthropologist, I was studying, I was living with Ashaninka people in the Peruvian Amazon, and this is the most biodiverse rainforest in the world. And yet these people had names in their language for just about every species of plant and ascribed uses to about half of them. And their knowledge about plant properties was remarkable. So this plant accelerates the healing of wounds. I had a wound, let's try it. It accelerated the healing of my wound. Many different cases like this, that finally I would ask them, so how do you know what you know about all these plants? And they'd say, well, we have these plants, teacher plants, tobacco, ayahuasca, other ones, and you take them, and with ayahuasca, for example, you see images and learn things. It's the television of the forest. As simple as that. And actually, if you want to know how we know what we know about plants, well, you have to drink ayahuasca, Brother Jeremy. So what is a plant teacher? Once again, it's not a sort of superstitious, irrational concept. It's a concrete proposition. You take this here vine, you make a brew out of it, and then you ingest it, having previously prepared your body by abstaining from certain foods and behaviors. And then you avail yourself to the ensuing experience, or what then unfolds in your body and in your mind. And I say body before mind, even though these are clear Western concepts. I mean, the Ashaninka do not have a concept for body, which would be opposed to something that we call mind, nor do they have a concept for mind. They don't distinguish between, they talk about a person, they talk about skin perhaps, and heart, where we might talk about body and mind. But still, so speaking with Western concepts, which is body and mind, when you swallow the bitter liquid, before being a psychedelic and giving you images or hallucinations or whatever you want to call them, you have this liquid that goes down into your body or into your skin envelope, as the Ashaninka would put it. And it's an intensely body-based experience. I mean, it works on your stomach and on your intestines before it works on your upstairs consciousness. You know, on the screen inside your mind. There will soon be images on the screen inside your mind, but before you get there, in Ashaninka, the word for ayahuasca is kamarampi, from the verb kamarank, to vomit, just saying. In other words, it goes down and it tends to clean you out, sometimes on both ends. And from the Ashaninka point of view, this is the main medical effect. You know, that's why they call it the vomitive. It's like saying, oh, Friday night, let's get together and take some vomitive. Oh yes, that's a good idea. I mean, what else are you going to do on Friday night? And so, and you know, it's not exactly entertainment. That this is not a recreational drug. You know, it's not like getting together and taking ecstasy on a Friday night and dancing at the discotheque. I mean, it's a difficult purging experience. You do get sometimes you get these visions that are extremely interesting. Those who know the plant, the indigenous people who work with the plant, will tell you that actually the visions are not the most important part, that all those flashing lights, and it depends on what has been mixed in with the vine itself. So you have different qualities of ayahuasca. If you take just pure ayahuasca vine, Banisteriopsis caapi, it will contain several harmaline alkaloids, no DMT. The DMT that might be in ayahuasca comes from several species of bush, Psychotria viridis being the main one, chacruna. It would seem that Westerners have understood ayahuasca as mainly being a drinkable form of DMT. So they like a lot of DMT fireworks. And so in places where Westerners go in the Amazon, people tend to brew up DMT heavy brews for the Westerners so that they get their money's worth. You know, they want a show. It's like a Yosemite Sam and Bugs Bunny. But in many different indigenous cultures, they use pure vine, which does not have any of this DMT, and but it still is psychoactive. You still do get images and some colors. The colors are darker. The images are more subtle. The teaching, the indigenous people say, is mainly comes from the vine, and so not in the spectacular visual fireworks that a DMT containing brew might give you, but more in those subtle, darker flows of sometimes images, sometimes thought, and also the body-based sensations when you are let's say you're purging. They say that the moments of most intense teaching and learning occur slightly before and slightly after the moments where, for example, you vomit. So you actually are in that process of purging yourself, and you're suffering. And at the same time, you're understanding things about yourself, or you may also be purging as you're thinking about something. And these are moments of intense these can be moments of intense self-understanding. That's a plant teacher. I mean, you know, it depends on who you are, but I find that ayahuasca is an intense and difficult teacher. I mean, I get kicked in the butt regularly by ayahuasca.
Jeremy, do you think also the interaction and relationship between the ayahuasca, and obviously you've mentioned previously about how it depends on the cocktail, and the personality of the person ingesting it will definitely have a different effect on different people, and also, as you've just said, that it kicks your butt, whereas with other personalities it may not be as aggressive?
Correct. And I think that Western knowledge has part of the puzzle. And so even though I was slightly critiquing the word psychedelic when applied to ayahuasca, because before being a question of the psyche, it's a question of the intestines. But still, what the focus on the psyche that the scientific psychedelic approach to these substances has led to understand, and this is something that the Czechoslovak psychiatrist Stan Grof said about LSD. When you take LSD, you do not have the experience of a drug, you have the experience of yourself. In other words, psychedelic, it reveals the psyche. It's like you take the lid off ordinary consciousness, and stuff that's in deeper parts of your brain and mind can come up to the surface. And so it depends on the traumas you've had. It depends on your birth. It might even depend on your past lives. It depends on the stuff that you're carrying around. This is also why ayahuasca works so well on people with post-traumatic stress disorder. You know, when you're a soldier and you've seen bodies blow up in front of you, and you sort of put the lid on all that, but still you don't sleep well, and you have suicidal thoughts and stuff like that. When you take ayahuasca, you don't even really need to remind these people to, don't forget to think about your trauma. In fact, this is what the medicine will do. It's going to take the lid off, and what is troubling the person is going to come up to the surface, and they're going to be able to treat it. And that's already half the solution, is allowing the stuff that's kept down under there to come out. Even though this can be, let's say, risky. And I mean, this should be said in any conversation, I think, about psychedelics, about LSD, ayahuasca, psilocybin, that you take a risk with your psyche when you take one of these psychedelics, because you cannot know before you've taken one how borderline you are or not. And these powerful substances or plants can precipitate somebody with psychotic issues over to the other side. In other words, it doesn't create psychosis, but it accelerates it, it precipitates it. And you can't know really how easy it's going to be for you to come back to normal consciousness. What is striking with ayahuasca is that it can take you so far away from normal consciousness so quickly into realms you hadn't even imagined. And then the next morning, bing, you're back. You're back. You're back to more or less to baseline. And you think, well, wow, that's for 99 point something percent of people, that's how it is. And that is the astonishing experience that most people have. But still, there are some people who have a hard time making it back to baseline. And it's a small minority of people. And sometimes it takes months and they become depersonalized, and then they have to go, and then they go back to their ordinary lives, and they go to see psychologists who don't really know how to deal with these questions. So that's where I think one needs to be careful with these plant teachers, especially when one comes from a culture that doesn't really know how to deal with them. You see, because in the Amazon, I think that the cultures there have been working with them for a long time. There's a lot of know-how in the culture, in different individuals. And so it's probably less discombobulating for an Amazonian person to take ayahuasca than for, let's just say, an ordinary Westerner like me. I don't know if you consider yourself an ordinary Westerner or not.
You know, I was going to bring that up. Thank you, because I've heard you speak in the past about how some of the Amazonian tribes, they metaphor, they sing. You know, it's singing, and I found truly that I grew up in the West, and I've been educated in the West, but I'm of Indian origin. And my mother, who is, and my father, both doctors. My mother is an obstetrician gynecologist, and my father was an ophthalmologist. So scientifically trained. However, because of the cultural background, my mother and most of her generation, honestly, it's not a generalization, most of her generation do not deal with issues. They allow the issues to come up and then just dissipate and leave. And that's a very Buddhist sort of way of dealing with that. You acknowledge it and then you allow it to leave rather than get hooked into it and get into the drama of the issue. So when I heard you speak about metaphoring, and because I'm so much more direct in analysis and speech, it's always very difficult for me to sometimes understand what my mother means. She says something but means something else. And I have to decode that because she's metaphoring. So I'd love to have your perspective on that and your experience.
Well, yes, thanks for the question. Not that many people ask it, but I'm happy to try to give almost a concrete reply. Because I've spent some time trying to listen to Amazonian people and understand their concepts. In different Amazonian cultures, They talk about these invisible entities that are common to all life forms and that are sources of information. And so each plant is animated by one of these invisible beings that corresponds to that plant's species. But these invisible beings are part of a whole world. So, for example, the Yaminawa people call these beings Yoshi. And they say that, so these Yoshi, they're invisible, they're multifaceted, they're inside of all living beings, and they animate them, and that it's possible to communicate with them in modified states of consciousness by using metaphoric and indirect language that they call tsai yoshto yoshto, which means language twisting. And these are concretely songs that Yaminawa shamans sing when they are in their trances, and they are songs addressed to the invisible beings that are all around us. And if you pay attention to the words that they sing, nothing in this Yoshto language, almost nothing is called by its usual name. So jaguars become baskets. Anacondas become hammocks. Night becomes swift tapirs. But in each case, the metaphoric logic is explained by an obscure but real connection. Jaguars are baskets because their markings resemble the patterns that are found on certain fibers used to make baskets. Anacondas are called hammocks because sometimes when they hang from trees, they look like hammocks. The Yaminawa say that if they use normal words to speak to these multifaceted beings, the normal words would crash into them. But with Yoshto metaphors, you can go in close and see them clearly, spiral around them. So by using another word to name them, it allows you to get a clearer understanding of their complexity. And when you look at these multifaceted beings from that point of view, they remind you of something, and at the same time, they're different. And that's how they are. They are like and not like, the same but different. And it's because they have no unitary nature that these Yoshto metaphors are the only adequate way of naming them. So here, metaphor is not incorrect naming. It's the only naming possible. And it is, as you were saying one thing to mean another. Mm-hmm. So it's like with a boomerang. So you aim over there to impact over here. And so it's a whole philosophy of recognizing the complexity in the world around us. And instead of imposing frontal language, spiraling around things and learning about the complexity that is there.
From different perspectives to get a more holistic viewpoint.
Well, think of a mirror ball in a discotheque.
Yeah, that's a very good analogy. Okay, so Jeremy, what do you think in practical terms we can learn from the indigenous people in terms of avoiding this really the worst outcomes of the ecological crisis that we seem to be in at the moment?
Well, I think that in your question, the part that is important to underline also is learn from. Because the point is not that we should try to become like them or imitate them. Because it's true that when you live in the Amazonian rainforest, it's one thing, and when you live in a hyper-industrialized world, it's another, even though these worlds are colliding. That the recipes for a small-scale Amazonian society are not necessarily going to work in a urban industrial world. So, but still, I think that what has become clear, not only by taking the knowledge of indigenous people into consideration, but also what science has demonstrated about the living world that we are in, is that it really is true that the plants, animals, and all the living species on this planet, including humans, are alive, intelligent, and related to us through kinship. It's there is the most of the Western culture and science itself was founded on the presupposition that somehow humans were separate from all the rest. So that there was humans on the one hand and nature on the other. That's actually the definition of nature. It's everything that is not human. And that somehow in Western philosophies and Western legal systems, humans are the only subjects and all the rest are objects. And it's because Renaissance Europeans started looking at the rest of the living world as objects that are distant from us and that we could study and objectify, that science became possible. And this is not to say that science has not been a powerful way of understanding the world. And this is almost like a paradox. After 350 years of this kind of objectifying science, science was able to prove the kinship that we have with other species, with DNA molecules and genetics. It is entirely confirmed through genetics that we are related to all living beings, including bacteria in this world. So it's not an animist metaphor. It's a factual, scientifically established statement. And yet we go on behaving as if we think that all these other species are objects that we can use as we please. And in fact, we are the only subjects here. And it's true what we can learn from Amazonian people. So these people are what we call animists. In other words, they think that there are people like us inside all other living species, and that we have kinship with them. And the animist paradox is that means that you're condemned to eat members of your family, because if you live in this world, you have to eat. So even if you're a vegetarian, you're going to be killing some carrots. And Amazonian people are not vegetarians; they're hunter-gatherers. I mean, they're eating everything that moves and that doesn't move. They're eating ants, they're eating plants. Frankly, there's very little that they don't eat. But in their own point of view, they're eating the members of their family. And so this means, how do you do that? Well, it means that you have to negotiate. You have to take their point of view into consideration. It's very important that if you're going to kill an animal, that you kill the animal well, and that you honor the meat. There's nothing worse than killing lots of animals and then just letting them rot, in the Amazonian point of view. And so it means establishing, so far, let's say the Western scientific materialist world has avoided having relations with the other beings on this planet that it uses as objects. So we've forgotten how to relate to other beings in the Western world and in Western cultures. And I think this is one of the things that we can learn from indigenous people, is that, okay, we're waking up to the fact that as Westerners, we come out of several centuries of culture that has led us to believe that we were the only intelligent subjects on the planet. And now we realize that, in fact, even a blade of grass has an intelligence and a point of view. And so what does this mean concretely? Well, learning to recognize the intelligence of other species, trying to take into account that they have intentions, they have a point of view, allowing them room to exist, and learning how to have relations with them. And what I think that we can learn from indigenous people. So how do you relate to, once you recognize the kinship that we have with plants and animals, well, how do you relate with them? Well, in the Ashaninka point of view, they use kinship. So some plants are sisters, other plants are brothers, some animals are brothers-in-laws or sisters. So they use that framework. And the difference between a brother and a brother-in-law, let's say, is a question of distance. And there are some animals, like poisonous snakes, that Ashaninka do not fit into the kinship system. In other words, really dangerous animals. They recognize that they were human at Siri at some point, so that they're not from the terrestrial family, but still, they're poisonous snakes are worse than brothers-in-law, in other words. That's the Ashaninka framework for making sense of how to relate with the natural world. I don't think that we have to apply that precise grid to get out of the mess we're in. And I think that other concepts for once one accepts that plants and animals each species has something like a personality or a point of view or a way of being that is something more than just being a bunch of molecules, and that we need to learn to start relating to these beings. Well, maybe not sister, brother, sister-in-law, but perhaps a friend, neighbor, doctor. So when you walk past the tree, good morning, doctor. When you address the blade of grass, sister, how you doing? You can, or amigo, when you run into a bird. In other words, rekindling that, recognizing that the world around us is alive, that they're not just objects, that we come from a culture that's forgotten how to relate, and that, I mean, who, if not us, is going to get started relating? So then it actually can lead you to reflections, like you start saying, you're calling the blades of grass sister and everything, and then you go and get the lawnmower and start mowing the lawn. I mean, so do you really want to mow the lawn? Do you really want to mow your sisters? Well, we're just cutting off the hair here. Okay, well, so in other words, it can lead you, it will necessarily lead you to think again about, what we do in the world. So that's kind of maybe, I'm not sure it's a tortuous answer to your question.
No, it's a perfect answer, because it's exactly what goes on in the East. It's exactly that. It's you're living in a jungle of negotiation every single moment. you know, and that's where discernment becomes it becomes not just a powerful tool, it becomes a necessary tool. You've got to be able to understand through knowledge and consciousness, who is it that's in front of you? Animal, plant, human, etc. So that's a very good answer. Thank you. Finally, I just want to bring in, you have doubts about the proposition that we should design a new planetary narrative. You resist using the word sacred to refer to our bond with the living world, and you question the notion of Mother Earth. Yet you agree with the aim of the Mothership Earth Summit, that deepening our relationship with the living world through a combination of science, wisdom teachings, and daily practices is the key to living responsibly in the biosphere. Could you tell us why?
Yeah. Well, designing a planetary narrative, first of all, I don't like the singular on narrative. In other words, I think that one of the strengths of human beings is that we're storytellers. And at this point, there's 8 billion of us. There might even be 8 billion points of view and 8 billion narratives. I'm exaggerating a bit, but still. I kind of like the fact that there are 8 billion points of view. I wouldn't want there to be only one point of view. And there was a science fiction story that had the nasty extraterrestrials come, and they wanted to find the leader of the human race and then just subdue the human race that way. But actually, they just couldn't get the human race to agree to anything. There was no leader. There was 8 billion people squabbling. But finally, when there was one enemy from outside, and they were unbeatable. They were unbeatable because they had 8 billion autonomous points of view. So that's, part of our strength. And it's designing a planetary narrative. Sounds like this, like a monotheistic religion that you'd come up with and then impose from above on the 8 billion. And so there's something that, and, narratives, I don't think you design them. I don't like combining the word design with narrative. In other words, telling stories, yes. Designing narratives, kind of grates. But I'm a stickler with words and stuff, so that's the first part. Even though I get the intention, I mean, I like narratives and planetary narratives and stuff like that. But just like that, designing a planetary narrative is like, sacred. I know that a lot of people in the spheres, so, I talk about Amazonian ecology, I talk about the rights of indigenous people, I talk about shamanism and ayahuasca, and in the circles that are interested by those subjects, a lot of people use the word sacred all the time. But what one learns as an anthropologist working with Amazonian people is that sacred is certainly not an Ashaninka word, it's not an indigenous Amazonian word. It's actually a frankly European Latin word. And what it means in Latin is separate from. And so it's one of these dichotomies between, profane and sacred. So what is profane? Well, it's the contrary of sacred. What is sacred? It's the contrary of profane. And so profane is ordinary stuff, and sacred is what is separate from ordinary stuff. Okay. So fair enough. I'm not saying that that this is a bad way of doing things. Just that if we're talking about the knowledge of Amazonian Ashaninka people, for example, their ayahuasca knowledge about the natural world, is this not the sacred? No, not at all. The whole point is that they say there's nothing that's separate between humans and all the rest, that it's one vast assembly of living beings, and there is nothing that is separate from or made separate from. It's almost the contrary of that. It's and so then, or else if you say, okay, well, then in their point of view, then everything is sacred. But actually, if everything is sacred, nothing is sacred. In other words, to say that, oh, in the Ashaninka view, everything is sacred, it is a meaningless statement simply logically, because either the sacred is what is separate from the normal thing, or if it's not, if it's the whole thing, then it's not the sacred. So I'm really weary of that word. I hardly ever use it except when I'm quoting other people, but it's one of those Western dichotomous words that, and then you see, we invent this thing, the sacred, which is, what is it again? Oh yes, it's the contrary of the profane. Okay, and then so we invent this concept. So we abstract the sacred out of the profane. And then we can define, we say, well, the sacred is this, the sacred is that. And then we turn it into something that we think actually exists out there. But it's a mental construction of people who subscribe to these concepts. And then so it's okay if you're going to say, okay, we're speaking a Western language, we're going to talk about Western spiritual traditions, or we're going to say the sacred is this church and that Vatican and this. Okay, well, you can do that. But in the Amazon, if you go to the Amazon and you're a Western, you start saying, for the Ashaninka, the sacred is this and the sacred is that. I mean, come on, you're importing a concept from out of town and imposing it on and creating distortions that actually are not there. And so using a word like the sacred when you're talking about Amazonian cultures is a form of intellectual imperialism, but don't get me started.
I completely concur, honestly, but having said that, as you pointed out correctly, that it is a language thing. I will give you a very quick example. In Sanskrit, dukkha, which was Buddha's word, and the West has just completely taken it on as meaning suffering, that's not what it means. It means dissatisfaction. And there is a vast difference between suffering and dissatisfaction. So I completely agree with you. However, as we've said, the English language specifically is quite linear. It's, it's not as multidimensional as some of the other languages, definitely some of the Eastern languages and the, I'm sure the indigenous languages. So I completely hear you. If you could just end by saying something just a little bit about how we could have daily practices in living more responsibly with the biosphere, that would be
yeah.
great.
I was somewhat talking about that with the blades of grass, and so you walk outside and you look at the tree and you say, good morning, doctor. I'm not saying that doing that is going to solve all the problems in the world, but yes, if you think about, I think that there can be 8 billion different points of view on this planet, but still, each one of those people, if they wanted to, could learn to recognize the intelligence of other species, recognize the existence of their points of view and try to take them into consideration and try to learn to have relations with them on the terms that they choose, not on the terms that I'm suggesting, but just that instead of looking at the tree and saying, oh, that's a tree and walking straight on, you can actually, if it's a tree that you walk by often, learn to see it as a being and then figure out, I think that it's like when you say you're an anthropologist and you go and live with a tribe like the Ashaninka people, actually they do this. The Ashaninka people come over to me and would say, well, okay, so how are we going to treat each other? Are we going to be brothers or are we going to be brothers-in-law? And I'd say what? They said, well, look, if we're going to be brothers, it means that we're going to be closer to each other. We're going to share our stuff, but we're not going to be trading partners. But if we're going to be brothers-in-law, it means we'll see each other less. But at that point, we can exchange things. Ah, okay. To most, I said, well, let's be brothers-in-law then. And with a few, I said, okay, let's be brothers. And so that you can actually, they call this fictional kinship, but it's not fictional. It's that, so you say, okay, this is how we're going to relate. And so when you walk past the street, so how are we going to treat each other? As the Ashaninka said to me, what am I going to call you? If we're going to have a relation, as a human, I talk. Trees don't talk. That's okay. But I talk. So, how am I going to call you? How am I going to think of you? How am I going to address you? How am I going to recognize that you're a being like me? And that, yeah, you're thriving. You want to live just like me. Learning once again to, so in our small practices, the science comes in because you know that tree is filled with cells just like you, that contain DNA just like yours, and that it really is true that there's a physical kinship between me with my cells and DNA and that tree. That tree is, and that kinship goes back 4,000 years. It's physicochemical and not at all metaphorical. So with that scientific knowledge, one can once again look at that tree and think about it and learn to relate to it. So these are the daily practices. How do we learn to see the living world around us for what it actually is? Multicellular, filled with intelligence, linked to us by kinship. It's all one big biospheric team, and we're small individual small cells within it. And I think that's what wisdom traditions, science, and daily practices can how they can come together and I don't know, perhaps turn us into more responsible, more caring beings. The point being to help life be itself.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you, Jeremy. As always, it's really fascinating and mesmerizing to listen to you. We could listen to you for hours. Thank you for the work that you do, and we are looking forward for your next book. Whenever
All right. Well, thank you very much for the fine questions and the understanding ear. And I think it's also interesting to compare the Western and the Indian or so actually what that last question, do you consider yourself a Westerner?
Not really, but I don't really consider myself completely Easterner either. It's very much, that's why I find what you say so interesting, because it's that meld of, you don't really know what you are because it keeps changing. Sometimes when I'm in the East, I behave differently, of course, and I have to navigate differently. And when I'm in the West, I behave differently. I have to navigate. And I've been fortunate enough to have the experience of both and the understanding to a certain degree of both. And like yourself, it's very much about the science as well as the spiritual, psycho-spiritual, natural, all of it together. It's a true diversity of life out there. And the more you engage, the more you realize that. And I do believe, though, one thing that's very clear from what you've spoken today is that the relationship then changes the behavior. So that's something where I think we can make very quick changes in our lifestyles by just building on new narratives around the relationship. That's the takeaway very much in the message. So once again, thank you so very much for that. And again, looking forward to chatting with you again soon.
Yes.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Jeremy.
Bye-bye.